The class this morning I figure is going to be pretty interesting because I have a subject to speak on from a perspective I don't think I've ever heard anyone speak from. And not like I'm trying to make anything of myself, like, oh, look what I can do, like, I'm just saying, I've read this in a book from another brother of ours, a book called Ox in the Ditch. Y'all may have heard of that. A brother of ours named Kerry Duke. He's in Tennessee. I forget what school it is up there, but anyways, I was reading the book and he was making a point about the idea of qualification, and he called it by priority of principle. And we're going to see what that is this morning, y'all. You're probably, what? What's that? We'll get into that. We'll describe that in just a moment here. But turn to Exodus chapter 20 and look at verses 8 through 11 with me. You have any questions or whatever, just again, raise your hand. This is a classroom. It's not designed to be a lecture. So if you have any questions or any comments, just raise your hand and be more than glad to hear what you have to say. Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. That there is the initial instructions, or I should say the official instructions for God to Israel to keep the Sabbath day in the law of Moses. Just a quick cover of some details here. Exodus 34:21 was saying teaches that it was to be observed at all seasons, year round. Exodus 35:3, they were to kindle no fire on the Sabbath day. Nehemiah 13:15, no laboring, no trading on the Sabbath day. Amos chapter 8 and verse 5, no market trade was to be done on the Sabbath day. In Jeremiah 17 verse 27, they were not to bear certain burdens on the Sabbath day. Exodus 35 and verse 2, the violation or the offense of the Sabbath day carried a serious penalty, which would be, yes, stoning, death, right, exactly. And we see in Numbers chapter 25, verses 32 through 36, we see a case there where that was indeed enforced. A man picking up sticks on the Sabbath day, and he was found and stoned for it. He was killed. So we can see the Sabbath day was a very serious implementation. God intended for it to be observed, and if it wasn't observed, it was to be a serious penalty meted out on the person who, on the violator. Now, bearing that in mind, because this plays an important role in what we're about to read in Matthew 12 now. If you want to turn over to Matthew 12, we'll read there the text we're dealing with here today. Matthew 12, starting in verse 1. We're good? Matthew 12, verse 1. And at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. Here's the relation there. On the Sabbath. And his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. But he said to them, Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And also in Mark's account it says the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. This account here has been a source of a lot of different understandings even amongst our brethren. You have probably are familiar with this, I'm assuming. Y'all have read this before. Everyone's talking about, David and the showbread and all that. That comes from this here, Matthew 12. And it's a good account to read because there's something very serious that needs to be understood here. And I think there's a point that should be understood and it should be made that I've never, not to discredit any other preachers. Understand, I just never heard it before. That's all. Never heard it taught in this regard until I read that book. And so pay close attention here and see what you think and analyze. 1 Thessalonians 5:17, test all, or 5:21, test all things, hold fast what is good. So test these things out. I've done that as well, and I think it's good so far. So pay attention and listen to this here and see what you say. In Matthew 12, what we just read, Jesus and his disciples on the Sabbath day, as it said in verse 1 and 2 there, they went into the grain fields on the Sabbath day. We read what the Sabbath, back in the very beginning of the lesson here, the Sabbath requirement, details about it, and all that. Then we see on that kind of day here in Matthew 12, his disciples were going through the grain fields, plucking grain heads and, eating. And the Pharisees accused them of violating the Sabbath. You're breaking the law. What are you doing? And so what does Jesus here do? He tries to what? He tries to justify what his disciples were doing, right? He tries to, he argues for them, right? He's not saying, yeah, you're right, my disciples are wrong. Guys, what are you doing? He wasn't doing all that, right? He tries to tell the Pharisees, he gives them argumentation to try to justify what the disciples were doing. What does he give them? What are his two lines of argument? What does he offer them to try to justify his disciples' actions? What does he say? In essence, and the basic arguments he's making are, number one, you have David, and number two, you have the priests, right? Jesus dishes these two out to them, and then he says at the end of the text in verse 7, if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. He's pointing out that his disciples were guiltless. And he says you wouldn't have blamed them if you had known what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He's showing y'all obviously don't know what that passage means, because if you did, you wouldn't have condemned my disciples. So, these two examples that he gave are very interesting because I think some folks may misunderstand what it's saying, and in good intentions, of course. But I think that sometimes we have maybe gone too far in trying to get away from an other end. There's a middle grounds we can be on sometimes. Sometimes here's error over here, and in the church, if you're not careful, sometimes you can go way over on the other extreme and say, well, this, to get away from the error. But it's like, well, no, the truth really is here, and it's still not error, but it's here instead. Or both ways are really not true. Like faith alone. That wasn't an effort to get away from a works-based salvation. But that went too far. Instead of saying, well, works, let's bring faith in there with works, he's saying, well, let's just get rid of works altogether and go with faith alone. It's like, well, no, that's still too far there. We're going to use both of them, have a happy middle in here. That's where the truth lies. Now, here with David and the showbread, this is a good example I want us to look at here. First of all, this Jesus' first example in justifying his disciples on the Sabbath going in the grain field and plucking grain. Verses 3 and 4, he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Now, Jesus is exactly right here, of course. In Leviticus 24, verses 5 through 8, in 1 Samuel 21, verse 6, makes it clear that the priests were to eat the showbread every Sabbath. Remember, they cooked loaves of bread, and it would be up there in the tabernacle, or in the temple. And at the end of the week, the priests would eat it, and they would make new. They would bake new loaves, right? On the Sabbath. So Jesus was right. Yeah, this was, it was only for the priests to eat. Now, there are some people out there in the world today, because keep in the context, in 1 Samuel 21, when David came to the temple there, he came to the priests and he asked them for food. Remember, David was on the run from Saul. And he lied to the priest and said, "Oh, well, Saul sent me quickly out on this on a mission here, by command to go." I forgot what he said exactly, but he basically lied and said, Saul wanted me to go do something, and we had to leave quickly, and we didn't have time to pack food and all that. Can you give me some bread?" But he was really running from Saul. But the priest went ahead and he allowed him to have some of the bread, which was only for the priests. Now, some have taken this passage, not in the church necessarily, but, well, probably. But some out in the world have called situation ethics, you probably have heard that before, where they say, well, the end justify the means. And they'll say, well, David was hungry, therefore he was able to take the bread. And that's the kind of reasoning they use as far as in every situation, as far as the end, as long as the end is a good goal, the means to get there is okay. Well, that's not true, and we'll look at that in a little bit in just a moment here. Now, some people say that David was wrong for eating the showbread because the showbread was for the priests. Now, what I want to hear at this point is, what do y'all have to say? Have you all ever given this much thought before? Have you heard people teach or preach about it? Have you given it thought? What do you think? Because, I mean, it's a historical fact. David went in there and ate the bread. And it's also true that it's in the law, like Jesus mentioned, and also in Leviticus 24. And as I said, 1 Samuel 21, the priest mentioned that to David before David ate. Oh, this is only for the priests. But David went and ate it anyway. So, was David in sin when he ate? Did he violate the law of Moses? Did he break the commands of God? Okay. Because, I mean, just... Okay. Mm-hmm. He what? He ate the bread. He gave it out. Okay. He didn't steal it. He asked the priest for it. The priest gave it to him. He lied about his circumstances, of course. Right. Okay. But you're saying that he should not have eaten it, though. He should have gone somewhere else and got something else to eat, really. Because that specific bread was for the priests, according to the law. Okay. Yes? I'm sorry? Luke 6:3. Okay. Did you want me to read that? But Jesus, answering them, said, "Have you not even read this? What David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him. How he went to the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those with him, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat." Right? Okay, so you're saying it was not lawful for him to eat it because it was for the priests to eat. Okay, well, Jesus said, that's true. I mean, Jesus did say that, and even in Matthew 12 he says that. Verse 4, he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat. Fair enough. Okay, any more thoughts before I go on? I just want to see where y'all stood as far as David and his actions there in that account. Because remember, all this is being used to justify Jesus' disciples being guiltless in what they're doing. And keep that in mind here in what's going on. Okay? All right, let's read on. And we're going to ask the question, we're going to answer the question, I think, that is Jesus teaching that David was wrong, or is he teaching that David was okay? He goes on to say, as you said here in the passage, have you not read what David did? That's what Jesus said. Have you not read what David did? Now, here's the big point right here that needs to be really seriously considered. Verse 5, the very first word there says, or. Or. Okay? That's the shifting point between two examples that are given to justify his disciples' actions, right? My disciples did this. Oh, they're wrong for doing that. Okay, well, have you not read, or have you not read? Okay? Now, Jesus is using these two examples, and he separates them with the word or. I want you to read this. It's very interesting. Y'all know Arndt and Gingrich? They're lexicographers, if you would. You know, they basically write a dictionary for the Greek language. That's what a lexicon is, just a Greek dictionary. The term or is the particle e, or if it looks like an e, but it's in the Greek. The particle a, or a, in Matthew 12:5, this is what Arndt Gingrich says, in Matthew 12:5 is used, quote, to introduce a question which is parallel to a preceding one or supplements it. Have you, and he goes and says, have you not read, or have you not read, and they quote Matthew 12:3 and verse 5 as well. Introduces a question which is parallel to a preceding one. In other words, and I agree with this, it makes sense. He's using two examples, and he's showing that the examples are parallel one to another. Have you not read that David did this? Or, have you not read the priest did that? Okay. Now, if he wanted to contrast the two accounts, he would have said, have you not read David did this, but have you not read this? Or he could have said, have you not read David did this, however, have you not read the priest did that? If he wanted to contrast, but he doesn't. He uses the word or. Now, here's a very crucial point in understanding this whole passage that we're reading, this Matthew 12, 1 through 8. Both of these arguments are in the same category concerning right and wrong because both are being used to justify the disciples. That's what Jesus is doing here. He's using two examples, and then he's going to go back to the Pharisees and say, if you had known what this passage means, or have you, if you know what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. He's giving them two examples that are parallel. Now, what then is the meaning of, because as you said before, Terry, and you were talking about it as well, in Matthew 12, in verse 4, Jesus did say it was not lawful, right, for David to eat the showbread. That's right. It was not lawful. So what does he mean by that? I mean, duh. It's not lawful. I can't really explain that much more clearly than that. Well, I don't think from the passage that Jesus was meaning that in a literal, actual way. Here's why. Because of the second example he gives. Have you not read in the law, verse 5 of Matthew 12, have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Now, folks, did you know what the priests did on the Sabbath when they went in and they made new showbread, they ate the old, they offered sacrifices and ate it? That was work that they should not have done according to Sabbath law. And Jesus is saying, well, the priests go in the temple on the Sabbath and they do all these things. They do all this work in the temple on the Sabbath day. They profane the Sabbath too? Hold on. In Numbers 28, verses 9 and 10, I want you to listen to this as I read it. And on the Sabbath day, 2 lambs in their first year without blemish, and 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a grain offering, mixed with oil with its drink offering. This is the burnt offering for every Sabbath, besides the regular burnt offering with its drink offering. The priests were commanded by God to work in the temple on the Sabbath. That was a command of God they were following. But Jesus in Matthew 12 says, have you not read how in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath? So what's he trying to say here? Can anyone make any sense of that? Why Jesus would say, well, the priests go in and profane the Sabbath when they were doing exactly what the law said. So how do we relate those two together? How do we bring them together? Come on. Mm-hmm. Okay, say the last thing one more time. What?
They were basically doing what they were instructed to do.
Right.
And in order to be right with God and follow His will.
Right. They had to do that. But they could say, well, they weren't observing Exodus 20 verses 8 through 11, what we read earlier. They were doing this work, and so therefore, how do you explain that? Well, what the priests did, I'll just put it to you like this. What the priests did was seemingly or apparently profaning the Sabbath because of how it may have looked. But Jesus was using the term profane in an accommodative sense. He was showing, what he was doing here in Matthew 12, is he was showing the absurdity of the Pharisees' charge by applying their reasoning to the priests. Okay, you see my disciples going through the field and plucking grains to eat. Well, if that's breaking the Sabbath, well, guess what? Then the priests are breaking the Sabbath too, because they're in the field, or they're in the temple offering up sacrifices on the Sabbath day, even though they're supposed to do it anyway. But he's saying, if y'all are going to reason like that, then guess what? Here's what you're stuck with. And you're also stuck with David being guilty because he ate the showbread when it was only for the priests, according to the law. Leviticus 24, 5 through 8. But here's the problem. In these parallels, you got David and the showbread, and you got the priest profaning the Sabbath. In these parallels, if you look at them, the phrase not lawful in David's account is parallel to the word profane in the priest's example. Look at this. David went into the temple. He went in the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Okay? On the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless. So you see what happens is, and plus, how do you get the idea that a priest can profane the Sabbath and be blameless? That makes no sense. I'm sinned, but I'm blameless. That doesn't make sense unless it has an appearance as an accommodative sense. They look like they're profane, but they're really not guilty. Why? Here's why. The Sabbath law was a general prohibition for the people, but there were exceptions for the law. The priests having to perform their duties in the temple. And that's one case. And Jesus says also that in the case where the table of the showbread rather, was to be for the priests, David came along and he was hungry and ate. And I think the phrase not lawful is also used in an accommodative sense because the examples are parallel, because he says, or David did this. Have you not read that David did this? Or have you not read how the priest did that? He's making parallel argumentation here, giving them two arguments on the same grounds, showing that David and the priest were both innocent, but you guys want to accuse my disciples for being wrong for the very same reasons that these two guys over here, the priests rather, and David were okay. Basically what's going on here is, if you want to turn over to John 2, is that we see this, what we mentioned earlier, qualification by priority of principle. Now, I'm going to make sure that there's no, because I know a lot of people may object. I've heard people say, that could lead to situation ethics and all that. No, it doesn't, and I'll clarify that in a moment why it does not. Because people say, well, if that's the case, Steve, and well, then you can just say, I can do this in this case because I'm hungry or something, and therefore I can go break into a grocery store and get some food because I'm hungry. Well, we're going to see why. It's like, well, God said David shouldn't eat the showbread. You're not supposed to steal either. So does that mean I can go ahead and violate and go break into a store and all and get? No, it does not mean that. And we'll see why in just a moment here. Because a lot of people, that's immediately the questions that come up and stuff like that, and things like along that line. So I was prepared for those just in case, but that's fine. In John 7, verses 22 and 23, it says there, Moses therefore gave you circumcision. John 7:22, Moses therefore gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. Okay? Remember the circumcision law, 8 days, the 8th day. Well, what if a child is born, on Friday? Problem. 8 days rolls around and we got a problem with the Sabbath here. We got a collision here. We got Sabbath law. We got circumcision law here colliding here. And Jesus says in John 7:23, if a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry with me because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? You see that? He said they circumcised a man on the Sabbath so that the law would not be broken. But someone says, well, what about the Sabbath law? Isn't that broken then? Because the Sabbath law does not apply under that circumstance, because there is a higher law. When I say higher law, I got to be careful when I say these phrases, because other people who have used situation ethics use that kind of thing too. They'll say a higher law. But that's not what I'm referring to. And again, I'll clear that up in just a moment. There is a more pertaining matter here. The health of that child has come into play versus the Sabbath labor law. And if you have two that come together, the child's health of the circumcision, and then you have the Sabbath labor law, and if you have to pick one over the other, which one do you think they're going to pick? The one for the child's sake. Because it's the law of love that man's supposed to have for his fellow man. When God instituted the Sabbath law, this was at Mount Sinai. Prior to that, there was no institution of the Sabbath law. There's no institution of the Sabbath law today, which tells me what? The Sabbath law is not something that is inherently sinful to not do. You understand what I'm saying? It's not inherently wrong to not observe the Sabbath because God only used it for a portion of human history. If it was something that that man had always had to do no matter what, it would have been in place from the creation. However, love for fellow man and care for humanitarian care or concern for a person's welfare and well-being, love, has been enforced from the very beginning and has never had any exceptions at all to violate that or to where it does not apply. That applies in all circumstances everywhere. And that's what happens when we have David in the showbread coming up. Is David had a human need, or he had a need for food. He was hungry, and he had to eat for his health reasons. And you had a law here that was apparently blocking his way. Well, the table of showbread, the showbread is for the priests only, and you can't eat that. But in this circumstance, he was allowed to, and because the table of the showbread was a law that was there for the sake or for the purpose of worship purposes. It was a positive requirement of worship. It wasn't something that was a moral law based on God's nature. And that's where this is not situation ethics. Because situation ethics would say you can violate a moral law, like breaking into a store. That violates love for the owner of the store. That violates the laws against stealing, which are moral laws based on God's very nature. Those laws will never be able to change, or they will never change because God's nature, which they are based upon, never changes. God's always God. So laws that are based upon who He is as a character will always be in place forever. Now, you think about this. What about, like today, for example? We take the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. Is it inherently wrong for a person to miss the Lord's Supper? No matter what. If you ever miss the Lord's Supper, I don't care what the reason is, you sinned. And you need to repent. And why is that? Okay. You're right. What about, here's what we say. When brethren are sick and they don't come, like I forgot, Tina, I want to say Tina Turner. I was like, no, Tina Taylor. She's not well. She's apparently pretty sick. According to, I was talking to what's the son's name? Robert. Talking to Robert, and he was saying that she's not. She's in bad shape. They haven't really even diagnosed her yet, and that. But she's, I'm assuming she's not coming to worship, right? Okay, so if she's sinning, and say, hey, Tina, you got a command of God here. Disciples met on the first day of the week to break bread. Acts 20, verse 7. You gonna repent? You gonna come forward when you get back? What? Why not? Isn't that a command of God? Wasn't the command for David to not eat the showbread there? David, you ate it. You're wrong. Tina, you're not here. You're in sin. You're wrong. Or are those laws that are general prohibitions, but there are times where other laws supersede them, because other laws that are universal and eternal laws. Because there's going to come a time where some things collide. As we saw in John 7, circumcision and the Sabbath. They came together. Which one are you going to do? And see, that's the thing that we have to keep in mind here, is that in the Old Testament, in the Old Testament, preeminence of love for one's neighbor was basic. That's what we saw in Matthew 7:12 when Jesus said, I used that earlier, therefore whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. You have love for your fellow man. That is a, essential. The first and second commands, the greatest commands, love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Those two have to always be in play. But it's never been inherently wrong to not do the acts of worship, because they have not always been in place from the beginning. So that shows that there is a time where God is okay with us not doing the acts of worship that He's appointed. And see, that's the difference between what I was saying here with this and situation ethics. Situation ethics would have you violate, like the cases given with the woman who's being held captive in Russia. What was that story, remember? Where the Russian guard would let her go back home to her husband and children if she would only fornicate with him. And she did, and the argument was, well, she can go home and be a mother and raise her kids, and she can love her husband and fulfill him and all that. And see, that was okay to fornicate because look what she's able to do. No, I would say never would that be okay, because that is where you are violating a law that is never not applicable, the law against fornication. There's never a time where that does not apply. But there are times where laws of worship, come and taking the Lord's Supper, singing songs and offering, like in Tina's case, they don't apply. It's not because Tina's not here. That doesn't mean she's breaking the law, because that by definition is sin. Violation of God's law, 1 John 3:4, is sin. Those laws don't apply to her at this time. And because of that, because she has a higher need to take care of her own health, that comes before her dragging her sick self in here and worshiping. So God accepts that. He understands that. Now, let me make something clear, because when I was I was doing this at Robinson Road once, and I think some people got confused saying, are you saying that the commands to come worship are not necessary? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We are definitely commanded to come worship. And when one of those higher laws, those universal laws, don't run up against all the commands to worship, we have to be here, or else we're in sin, yes. You can't be at home and say, oh, well, are you saying I can go, like yesterday, I can go work on my car. Like I was yesterday, I could stay and say, well, I'm going to work on my car today and miss out on worship. No, because that's not pertaining to something that you have to have. It's not a universal law that's going to be violated in doing that, as far as there's nothing inherent in that that's necessary for you to do. That can wait. But if I saw a man on the way to worship that was lying on the side of the road bleeding and looked like, okay, this guy needs some help, what do? Sorry, buddy, I got commands of God to obey. I'll see you later. You can't do that. You got to put worship aside. But God's not going to hold you accountable for that, because He says, okay, in this case, Steve, I want you to tend to this man because he needs your help. You need to show him your love. And so going back to Matthew 12, that there is a case where I think David was okay in eating the showbread because of the need he had the need he had there in the situation. That doesn't mean that you can go violate God's laws and just throw up any miserable or little excuse, whatever you want. That's not at all what it's saying there. Jesus is saying, that's when He says in verse, go back to Matthew 12, where He says in verse 7, but if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. He's basically showing them that, I have a place how I put it, that the significance of that expression is this. The benevolent life or benevolent life is more primary in the sight of God than offerings and sacrifices. God desires mercy and not sacrifice. Yes, that's not to say that he doesn't want you to sacrifice. No more in the sense that in Acts 5 and verse 4, remember when Ananias and Sapphira lied to Peter? They lied to Peter, right? But what does he say? You have not lied to men, but to God. I mean, stood up and said, well, Peter, they did lie to you. So what's Peter talking about? He's emphasizing the fact that most and more importantly, more primarily, you lied to God. And that's what Jesus is teaching in Matthew 12 and verse 7. Had you known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not had condemned the guiltless. If you had known that God is more primarily concerned with the laws concerning love and human welfare and well-being than he is with observing the Sabbath, you wouldn't have condemned these men then. But you're so focused on the Sabbath as if that can't be broken in any circumstance. Someone does this, and you want to condemn them as guiltless. Well, guess what? If that's the case, then the priests are guilty too. David was guilty as well. But they know that the priests aren't guilty because they're going to go ahead and do it every week. So he's trying to expose them and show to them their reasoning that is faulty. And so I think in Matthew 12, what you have here is three cases where these men were, or these three cases where all people in these cases were innocent in what they were doing. And again, you've got to be careful because I don't want people to get the wrong idea. Because, once I leave, I'll know, y'all may discuss with one another what they said. Y'all may mention to Sean when he comes back, hey, Steve said something. What do you think about this? Which is fine. I don't care. This is a public class. You can tell whoever you want. It's being recorded. I don't care. Whoever hears this is fine. So I'm not going to be like, talking behind my back or nothing. That's fine. Go talk to people about what we spoke here today. But what I'm saying is before it's over and I'm gone, I can't, respond right now. Is there any questions or any comments or any misunderstandings you have? Because I want to make sure that I'm not being misunderstood. That's all. Yes, sir.
I like this lesson because I can see what you're highlighting. We have to be cautious about quick reaction. We have to show compassion for our brothers and sisters in Christ. Pointing out issues
Mm-hmm.
and working through life's hardships, life's troubles, people's issues, and not simply condemn them and push them away. Here, I think Christ is saying, we do need to have compassion for each other and be aware of where people cross the line and where, maybe they make a mistake and be correct.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true today very much. 1 Corinthians 13, the mindset of love there. Romans chapter 1, verse 29 talks about evil-mindedness, putting the worst spin to something. Like if you see something going on, that's what Jesus said in John 7:24, judge righteous judgment, If we're not careful, we can see something and assume that it had bad intentions or bad reasons and say, oh, look what they did. Like, what if I didn't see, like, for example, I keep using Tina. Nothing personal, but I'm just saying she's a good example because she's not here. What if she's not here today? I see her, I'm like, she's not very faithful, is she? It's like, well, when you understand that there are times where worship is not, where there are commands to come to worship, the sacrifice. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. If you understand that there are times where sacrifice in that phrase is not applied because mercy triumphs it because there comes a collision in the road, well, then when we see people gone or not doing certain commands that are not universal in every situation, we can't just automatically assume it's for a bad reason. Now, if I see someone fornicating, I can automatically say that is wrong. because there's never a time where it's okay to fornicate or steal or lie, and they can't come back, well, I was doing it because this was going on. That doesn't matter. That law that's a universal, all-time prohibition, no exceptions. But worship, those things are appointed by God to test our faith. They're not based on our character. They're not based on God's character. There's nothing inherent in the nature of God that would have him issue a command to take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. It has no relation there. But they're commands given, like baptism, immersion in water. There's nothing inherently sinful in not immersing in water. It's bad, yeah. And the Pharisees got on about it. You taking up your bed on the Sabbath? It's like you don't understand. They don't understand. It was the primary need there to heal a man and for his health and well-being, for humanitarian purposes, superseded the law for him to just sit there and wait for tomorrow to be healed. It's like we have a more important issue here. The Sabbath does not apply to this man. He can take up his bed and go. He's been healed. But they just didn't understand that.
John 7:24,
And-
according to the appearance, but judging with righteous judgment.
Right, exactly. And they didn't do that. That's right there in that context, is it not? Or no, that's John 5 you're talking about. But we read earlier with Moses and the circumcision. That was followed right after what we just read about the circumcision issue. Judge with righteous judgment. Just because you see this person being circumcised on the Sabbath, you don't understand. You need to find out more what's going on here. And I know I've heard brethren back when I was in Brown Trail say, I know one guy who said that if you miss worship, it's sinful. I was like, it is? And I'd only been a Christian for like a year and a half or so. And, I was more a babe in Christ then, I would say. And I was just like, I mean, it wasn't like no, and I had like a, full line of argumentation to refute them just like that. But I was like, oh, okay. And I look back on that now, I'm like, sometimes, and this is a preacher saying this stuff. And I'm like, sometimes people say things, I'm like, well, what do you say then when people are gone because of, somebody's sick or something, and you think it's wrong? Like, and then, of course, which is a whole other issue, I'm going to open a can of worms. I know it's 11:17. The issue of work and worship. I know a lot of people struggle with that, and I think there's a lot of good ideas, good thoughts out there pertaining to that. I won't get into that. But I do think work is different from play. If I'm out of service because of leisure or, something like that versus work, because we are commanded to work, we are commanded to have a job and support our families, that needs to be considered when balancing that out with our services, our duties to worship. But I don't want to say anything now to get me in trouble on that. I'll wait for another time for that. But I hope this has been helpful, though, this what we just discussed about Matthew 12. Mm-hmm.
How do we contrast that with, I mean, in our mind, it's more willful missing service versus a circumstance, you're sick, or someone's on the side of the road sick.
I've had a car break down on me before on the way to worship. That has actually happened to me. Remember Kansas City? We went to get some breakfast and we got in the car. I was like, oh, now? I was like, we missed the morning services. I had to go get a battery for my car. I couldn't go. I was like, wow. I mean, all the times people throw that out as a, if your car breaks down, it's like, wow, that actually happened. On the way to worship, my car died. So I wasn't like, I didn't come to service that night and say, I repent, I wasn't here this morning. I'm sorry, y'all. I confess my sins. Right. I can't do anything about it. I did what I could. I mean, I cannot prophesy and foresee that my car is going to break down and say, oh, Kim, let's get in the other car, because guess what? The Cadillac's going to break down this morning. I can't do that. Just wasn't created with that ability. So, but that's, you're right. I mean, people willfully forsaking because of, This,
Down to the heart of a man, that's why it's talking about mercy versus, you've got mercy as the heart of the person versus sacrifice as the action of the person. And you've got somebody who, like people that miss on Sunday, and then, because they're doing what they want to do, their heart isn't seeking first.
Mhm.
They're not seeking first coming to edify the kingdom, to be with the kingdom.
right.
To glorify the Creator who gave them their job
Right.
or their breath or whatever.
Well, it's like in this passage here, like you said, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. If we're not going to be here, we have to think to ourselves, well, is the reason I'm being here because there is something, when I say something more important, I hate to put it like that because it makes it sound like worship's not important. But I guess in a relative sense, but is there a more universal law that's come into play here that I have to tend to first that would cause me to have to miss worship? But if the reason why we're missing worship is because of something that is really trivial in nature, that's no good. That's no good. God's not going to accept that. We see these cases here. He does accept these cases with David and the priests and all. But no, not when we just have some trivial matter. That would be good to class to have, though, the whole worship thing, wouldn't it? Work and worship. Ask Sean, do class, work and worship. Let's do it. He'd be like, oh, man, you're going to have him sweating heavy on Saturday night. No, that'd be a good class, though. But that's good stuff, and, I've heard people, when I hear people say, oh, well, gee, I'm running over my time. But when people say David was wrong and he sinned, and they use that, they say that they try to keep situation ethics out the door with that. But I don't think you have to say all that to keep situation ethics out the door. And I think that makes David look wrong when he really wasn't wrong. You know what I mean? And let's just be careful when they say, oh, you're making up stuff. Oh, well, the Pharisees glorified David, and Jesus is saying, well, if you justify David doing it, it's like, well, where do we get all that from? I'm not saying they did, but it's like, it seems like that's too much. I don't see all that. Like, we're throwing so much more extra in there, like we're, how the Pharisees view David and all that. Well, just look at this passage here. I mean, just look what we said, the text itself. David did this, or the priest did that. The priest really didn't profane. David really wasn't not lawful. Therefore, you wouldn't have condemned the guiltless if you understood what this meant. Kind of makes sense. You look like you really deep in thought there, Mr. Branster. He's staring at that ceiling hard.
It's either black or white.
Well, yeah. I mean, he didn't kind of sin.
Well, I see what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Think about it, man. Think about it more. You're on Facebook, so you can send your thoughts my way. I'll send mine your way. That's fine with me. That's fine with me.
They were looking at work the wrong way. They were putting man's restriction on what work was. When
The Pharisees did
they
overdo the
weren't-
Sabbath.
They
True.
weren't working. They were feeding themselves. They weren't plowing the field. They were picking a few heads of grain to feed themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It was different. It wasn't. I mean, they're trying to make a mountain out of a molehill.
Mm-hmm.
Just to.
Well, they did do that.
just to pinpoint something.
Well, if you've read some of the traditions the Pharisees had done back in the first century, it's ridiculous. They said on the Sabbath, I forgot what it was, like they had to lay. I have some of the stuff at home, but they couldn't. Yeah, but they had to lay on a certain side in their bed, and they couldn't roll over a certain number of times. It was really ridiculous. I'm like, are you serious? That's like, just oh man, just give me like some sleeping pills or something. I'd rather just sleep through the day or something or whatever. But I'm just saying that's crazy. They had some stuff that was really, really, really ridiculous, and it's like, man. But yeah, that's what they were known for, binding man's traditions to the law of Moses. Not ever really well, that's another matter. Okay.
And not understanding what the law was there for. And that's this thing. And the law was there for to guide them.
A tutor to bring us to Christ. That's what Galatians 3 says. Yeah.
Not to be a burden upon them, but it was to guide them.
And that's what Jesus said, and that's what I think he meant in that passage, that verse in Mark's account where he says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It's like you're not a slave to the Sabbath to keep it rigidly regardless of what's going on. The Sabbath was made to accommodate you and help you out. I think that's what Jesus is saying when he said that.
I guess,
But
maybe, I mean, because I'm sitting here thinking, how do you then, because I'm like, man, I mean, to me things are black and white. You're either wrong or you're right, period.
mm-hmm.
And if you start justifying, then you end up with compromise and being in error, because you start believing the black or white. I don't think there's any gray. And with this, thinking about what we talked about with Uzzah,
Mm-hmm.
okay, the sincerity, I mean, Uzzah didn't want it to fall. He was thinking about the better good of the ark. And, you know what I'm saying? Like, how do these
But
things...
that would serve no higher
law. But David didn't. Why didn't God strike David dead? Because he took the showbread.
Because they weren't supposed to be carrying it. They're supposed to have it on their shoulders.
I know, but he wasn't supposed to be eating it. That's what I'm saying. Like,
There was a different purpose being served, though. Under Uzzah's, he was steadying the ark. It wasn't supposed to be touching. You're true. I mean, if the ark fell, that was their fault for transporting it that way. That would be a consequence they had to go through. But there was no higher need that he was serving there that would say, okay, it's okay for him to touch the ark at this point because there's a more universal law in play here that's going to be compromised if he doesn't touch the ark. In other words, there was no more authoritative law here pushing him or demanding that he would have to touch the ark. Nothing he could rest upon. He would have no argument on his part. David could, though. David had a higher purpose to serve. And that's the difference between David and Uzzah, I would say, on that part there. I know what you're saying, though. But you got to admit then, okay, I go back to this point. Then why aren't people here for worship when they're sick? Bring them on in. And because if they aren't here, then we got to get on them for not, if it's going to be so black and white, we got to start applying it like that then. It's wrong for them to not assemble on the first day of the week. Then we got to address these brethren who aren't here today. But we make exceptions there. We allow it. And we don't think they were in sin, even though the law says. You see what I mean? And I'm saying is that's been in play, not just in the New Testament, but all the way back. And I just think, as far as us, I admit, because there's all kinds of scenarios you can come up with. And I'm not saying, I don't have the answer for every scenario, but there are times and places where there are exceptions where these things don't apply. We have to at least acknowledge that and say, yes, that is the truth. Not being able to apply it in certain circumstances doesn't deny the fact that it is true. Just like I heard a guy in a debate one time, just because you don't know how to apply or ethics in every circumstance does not therefore do away with the idea that there is a universal standard of ethics. Applied ethics is different. Just like applying this principle is a different story than acknowledging that is a principle that is true. Now, applying it is a whole other issue. Don't let difficulties in applying it cause us to deny that the principle exists. That's my point.
You don't want to come into service if they got the flu.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you're sick, but on the other hand, too, I wouldn't want to come if I had flu, especially if I was contagious. I wouldn't want to, infect brethren, especially their children. I've been like, I would like to be there, but on the other hand, I got to consider, is it going to be, what if the brethren find out I'm contagious with the flu? They'd be like, get out of here, Or you can have, we'll open the doors, you can stand out there in the grass or something. It's too hot to do that. But,
When you opened up the class, I think you started out well by saying we have to be careful not to take things from one extreme to the other.
Right, yeah, because that happens.
Follow the whole counsel of God. As you also mentioned, if you disagree with anything I'm saying, study God's word.
Definitely.
Work it out yourself. Don't go from one extreme or to the other. Don't be like liberal rather than bringing musical instruments or some that do one cup because
Right. That's a good example.
we'll work these things out with each other. Always look to the counsel of
Mm-hmm.
Too often people want this, put the thumb on something, this is the way it is.
Right.
And that's easier to do than to take the extra time and the work.
To look it out. That's a problem that people in denominations have too. Not just, and I shouldn't say not just denominations, but some, people in the church too, is taking the time to really sit down and look into something. And not being distracted by stuff, Let me focus on this one particular thing and let me see how solid it is. If a lot of people did that, if a lot of people gave more critical thinking, I know there'd be a lot less error in the world. But failure to critically analyze things has led so much division and blah. Blah, yeah. But, so anyways. But I mean, it's good stuff to discuss, and I think there is a reason here. I think it's reasonable. I think it's a true principle that's in play. Admittedly, it's not the easiest thing to evaluate every circumstance. You're going to have 1,000,001 of those. But using the best of our ability to evaluate them. And, it's like the Hebrews writer said, those who are of mature age are able to eat the meat so they can discern between good and evil. The more we mature, the more we're able to discern what's right and wrong. So if we don't ever look into these things, we just remain where we are as far as our ability to discern. Can I do this? Can I not do that? Whatever. Okay. Is that long enough? I appreciate y'all's interest though. Y'all seem attentive. I like that. That's good. So yeah. Hopefully I'll get a good call from Sean when I get back. Like, Steve, we need to talk. That's okay. Like, have at it. But okay, well, good. Y'all know I'm on Facebook, so if you have any more, if you have any more, we can discuss further. You just send stuff my way, and we'll have no problem at all. I like it. It's good. Okay. Well, thank you very, very much. I appreciate it.